Yes, well, if you get our newsletter, you would have received this story from the recent scientific news. In fact, it was just last week's main story in the journal called Science. And of course, once reports get sent out in the scientific journals, journalists then pick these up. And also the universities that publish them put out press releases. And a common term in the various press releases to do with this particular story was the term junk DNA. And here are some of the headlines that were in some of the news stories. Butterfly wing patterns emerge from ancient junk DNA. And that was from Cornell University's own press release. That was their headline. Now, Science Daily is a website that actually picks up on these press releases. We find it a very useful source of our stories. And then again, another one similar, SciTech Daily. Slight variation of that headline: gene-edited butterfly mutants reveal sequence of ancient junk DNA. Now, that is a term that should have been put in the bin a long time ago. And in fact, in the professional literature, it certainly has, because it comes from the idea that in our DNA, we are carrying around a whole lot of evolutionary leftovers, bits of DNA that we've inherited from our evolutionary forebears. Now, again, this idea has been debunked when some real science has been applied to this supposed junk DNA. And as the genome revolution has gone on, we've had more and more evidence for creation, more and more evidence for that the Bible is true. It's just like in the archaeology, right? Stand your ground. Eventually the science and the scientists will catch up. And so this is what was reported in the actual original science scientific journal, right? Science is the name of the journal. And in the science editor's summary, we have this term: deeply conserved non-coding DNA. Now, that's a bit of a movement away from junk DNA. It's not quite as condemnatory, as it were. It's not condemning this, but it's still implying that somehow this is not really useful DNA. But in fact, it's exceedingly useful DNA, and that was the whole point of this report. And so the scientists who did this experiment, looking at butterfly wing patterns and how they're organized, called them what they should be called: regulatory elements. In other words, parts of the DNA that actually regulate or control the main genes. And one of the most important things we have discovered in the genome revolution is that it is not enough just to have the actual genes for proteins and body structures and body tissues. They have to be turned on and off at the right time. They have to be turned to the right sort of levels. So there are all these control genes or regulatory elements which are not non-coding, because they actually contain a lot of information. So non-coding is also an equally false term. They are regulatory elements or control genes. So why do the science journalists persist in using junk DNA? Well, it maintains the theory of evolution, of course, because that's the mindset that they have. We're all carrying around all of this stuff from millions of years of evolution. And I also wonder whether they don't really like the idea of regulatory elements, because it does imply that there is a regulator somewhere. In other words, someone who's outside the system, who might be in control, and they're not. If you want to read the details of that report, it's now on our fact file. We archive all of these science items, so just look up Creation Fact File and you will find it there. And at the moment, because it's a news story, there's a nice picture of a butterfly there. But anyway, it does lead into what we want to talk about tonight, which is vestigial organs, because it's the same mindset, whether you're talking about DNA or whether you're talking about entire body structures. Very early on, when evolution was being promoted, this whole concept that we are carrying around remnants of somehow millions of years of evolution. And Darwin himself wrote about this. He didn't use the term vestigial. He referred to them as rudimentary organs. In other words, rudiments or things from the past that no longer are functional in our bodies. And this is an idea that has stuck. Now, partly when scientists did look at the human body, they did find some things that just didn't seem to have much function. They were sort of little knobs of tissue. And we had to wait until the technology developed. So some of the endocrine organs, which just look like little blobs of tissue that don't seem to do anything, in fact, they are actually essential for life. But we had to wait till we had the chemical technology to analyze the secretions that they make. But at the same time, because they got stuck in this mindset of vestigial organs or leftovers from evolution, that term has persisted, even though the original list of these things, I think in about the 1890s, someone put out a list of about 90 of them. That's been whittled down to a few, but they have been particularly persistent, and it's still in the mindset of many people. So we thought we'd have a look at a few of them, a few of the more well-known ones, and look at what's happened when someone has actually done some real investigation into them. So let's start off with that one we've just talked about, the so-called tailbone, which was supposedly a leftover from tailed ancestors. Now, you have to actually go back quite a few steps to get to a tailed ancestor, because apes don't have tails, but monkeys do. And that very last bone, that little triangular bone right at the base of the spine, is commonly called the tailbone. In fact, people who have injured it will sometimes tell you, oh, I fell over and I bruised or broke my tailbone and it was agony. We'll come back to that because that's an important point. Its proper name is the Coccyx, and the anatomist who gave it that name thought it looked like a cuckoo's beak. Well, I'll leave that to the bird experts as to how accurate that is in terms of the structure of a cuckoo's beak. But it is a small, curved, triangular structure. And as usual, you never look at anything in the body by itself. You have to look at things in their context. And in fact, the coccyx is an important muscle and ligament anchor point. So if you put it into its context, that basal part of the spine there, the last part of the spine, the sacrum is the big triangle, and the coccyx is a little triangle hanging off the bottom there. That forms part of the pelvis, which is a ring of bone, and that supports all of your pelvic organs, which perform some exceedingly useful functions. So it's an anchor point for the muscles of the pelvic floor and the ligaments of the pelvic floor. And if anyone has broken or bruised their coccyx, they'll tell you it is absolute agony every time they try to move, because of all of those connections. So an essential part of our anatomy that's been known for a long time, but because of this firm belief that we carry around evolutionary leftovers, the term tailbone has stuck. Now, the other classic one, of course, is the appendix, which is part of the digestive system. Now, the digestive system is not quite that colourful, but I didn't think you would really appreciate a true anatomical photo of your various insides. But anyway, the appendix is a small blind-ended pouch that sticks out at the end of the large intestine. Now, it's the beginning of the large intestine in terms of the flow. So as you flow from the small intestine into the large intestine, the appendix is a bit that sort of hangs off the bottom. So it's near the junction of the small intestine and the large intestine. And this is the sort of popular science that gets published every now and again. This does come from 2005, but it expresses the belief rather well of what what people generally think of. In plant-eating vertebrates, the appendix is much larger and its main function is to help digest a large herbivorous diet. Well, that alone is disputed, but anyway. The human appendix is a small pouch attached to the large intestine where it joins the small intestine and does not directly assist digestion. That's true. It doesn't directly assist digestion, but that doesn't mean it's useless. The next sentence, biologists believe it is a vestigial organ left behind from a plant-eating ancestor. Well, that has been challenged by the secular scientists themselves. A few years ago, a group of scientists got together and they did an appendix evolution study, if you like. Now, they really got stuck into this. They did a survey of 361 living mammals, and 50 of these species actually had something that could be described as an appendix. It's not always the same shape as a human appendix, but it definitely fits the description of an appendix. And what they did is they looked at their diet, but they also looked at various other aspects of their lives and their lifestyle and their habits. And they tried to put this into an evolutionary tree of mammals. And they came up with this extraordinary conclusion. No correlation was found between the appearance of an appendix and evolutionary changes in diet, fermentation strategy. In other words, how food is digested, particularly in creatures that are completely vegetarian. They ferment their food within their digestive system. Coprophagia, if you really want to know what that means, it means eating the animal's droppings and reprocessing them. All right, social group size, activity pattern, cecal shape. The cecum is the name of the first part of the large intestine where the small intestine joins on it, or colonic separation mechanism, in other words, how the large intestine works. So there was no correlation between any of those things and the evolutionary changes. In other words, they couldn't fit it into a nice evolutionary tree. So they then decided, well, we can't fit it into an evolutionary pattern. And this is a good example of how evolution is actually an anti-science idea, really. It doesn't help anybody. In fact, it condemns people to not doing science, because if you find something that you don't know what it does, the scientific solution is to do some more research. Well, human curiosity does prevail, and these scientists did that more research. And they came up with this extraordinary conclusion. The appendix has evolved minimally for 32 times. Now, it takes a lot of faith to believe that pure chance random processes are going to produce a complex structure, and the appendix does have a complex structure. It takes a lot of faith to believe that that would just happen by molecules banging into one another. So it seems that the evolutionists have to have 32 times as much faith as the Christians. Anyway, they went on to say these results, together with the immunological and medical evidence, refute some of Darwin's hypotheses. In other words, Darwin's idea that we're all carrying around a whole lot of evolutionary baggage, and suggest that the appendix is adaptive. Now, by adaptive, they mean useful, but it has not evolved as a response to any particular dietary or social factor evaluated here. So it's not because animals changed their diet, they suddenly grew an appendix. So they've really blown this one out of the water 32 times. Right. So, in fact, the appendix is a functional structure, and we should have known that the first time that anyone looked at it underneath a microscope, because they saw that it was full of tissue called lymphoid tissue, and there's a lot of that around the gastrointestinal tract. Because one of the things that we've also learned about fairly recently is this term, the microbiome. We live with a whole lot of bacteria living on our internal body surfaces. You know, these are the so-called good bacteria that the people who sell yogurt and things like that advertise about. And most bacteria are actually good. So we now have our microbiome, but even that has to be kept in its place. So lymphoid tissue is immune tissue. It decides what belongs inside the human body and what doesn't, and what is considered to be enemies and needs to be shut down. And in our in our modern world, of course, or in our fallen world, we have diseases. So if there's any inflammation in the large bowel, the microbiome can be damaged. And it's interesting, the appendix has been found to be a sort of safe house for the good bacteria if there is an inflammatory problem with the large bowel. So a useful functioning structure. Now, here's one that you might not be familiar with that's considered to be a vestigial function, and that's swinging your arms. Now, Joseph, I'm sure you like to go for walks along the beach. You used to live near the coast, didn't you?
Right next to the coast,
Yes. So I'm sure you walked along the beach many times. And
normally with sort of very bent back looking for fossils.
So that's right, yes, and then carrying them back. But if you were just going for a walk, you just naturally swing your arms. You don't even think about it. Now, of course, soldiers on parade are taught to do that. But even if you're just going for a casual walk, it just happens. And because of that, because you don't consciously think about it, it was considered to be an evolutionary leftover from our quadruped ancestors.
Like from when we were like walkers,
that's right. Yeah. When we walked on all fours, so we used our arms to walk as well as our legs. Now again, somebody did some real science here. So they did a study which was a bit like I don't know if any of you remember Monty Python. One of their classic sketches was called The Ministry of Silly Walks. Now, that's nothing to do with current British politics.
Wow. I would say,
debatable, Diane, debatable.
Yes, well, we might not go there, but anyway. But what they got to do is that they actually studied how much energy you use with different styles of walking. So they got people to deliberately walk, first of all, studying them just how they naturally walk, which meant their arms just your arms swing, and they swing in opposite direction to your legs. And that just seems to be a natural cycle that you do without thinking of it. Then they got the same people to walk in these sort of silly walks, sort of. One was holding the arms the side, one was arm swinging the same side as your legs. That's actually quite hard to do. You've really got to think about that. And it turned out that the natural arm swinging, in other words, what you do when you're casually going for a walk and your arms just naturally swing without you thinking about it, that used the least energy. So in fact, it was a useful function. And this was their conclusion. Rather than being a facultative relic of the locomotion needs of our quadrupedal ancestors. Now notice they've still got the evolutionary mindset in there. Then they're not going to get rid of that. But they have decided that arm swinging is an integral part of the energy economy of the human gait. In other words, the human walking style. So swinging your arms is a useful function. So you can throw out the bit about quadrupedal ancestors. The science is still the same. It's a useful function. So this is what we're trying to do with our science reports, help people discern what was actually discovered and what's the story they're telling about it or they're trying to fit it into. Because quite often, in fact, every time, if you look at what they actually discovered, it fits better into the Bible than it fits into the evolutionary story. So let's move on. Another one that's considered to be a useless leftover from our quadrupedal ancestors, who were also very hairy. And when you think about it, it's an interesting conundrum. If we evolved from a creature that was covered with hair that protected it from the sun all over the body and was good for thermoregulation, why would we evolve into a creature that has no hair except on its head, and then it's got long hair that gets caught in things, and we have to wear clothes? Well, maybe that's not quite so true, right? But again, in this article that was put out quite a few years ago, but this mindset is still there. Some hair is helpful to humans. They sort of grudgingly accept. Eyebrows can keep sweat out of the eyes. And this is an interesting one. Facial hair might influence a woman's choice of sexual partner. All the rest of that hair is essentially useless. Well, that's not actually true, and we've known that for a long, long time. It's not useless. Okay. There are obvious uses for hair. Yes, it does protect the tops of our heads from the sun, particularly if you live in Australia, even though most Australians do wear hats. But anyone who has gone bald will tell you that thermoregulation, in other words, heat loss, is quite a problem. And so the hair on top of your head does have a thermoregulation function. One that you may not be aware of, well, you're aware of it, but you might not think about it, is that hair is actually a sensory receptor. If you just rub your hand along the hair on the back of your forearm, if you're not wearing long sleeves, without actually touching your skin, just touch the hairs, you can feel that, because hair follicles actually have a nerve attached to them. And the other important one is that hair follicles are involved in lubricating your skin. Now, to understand that, we need to actually look at the microscopic structure of a hair follicle. And a hair follicle is not just an anchor point for the hair shafts, which actually project out of the skin surface. They all have an oil gland attached to them. And at the bottom there, which is not illustrated in this picture, there is a nerve connection to a touch receptor. So hair follicles are very, very useful. They have a good function. But the other interesting aspect of hair follicles that's really considered a vestigial function relates to this little thing there called the Erector Pili muscle on the side. And that is what gives you goosebumps, which is your hair standing on your end when you are cold and stressed. Now, the standard story for this is that we evolved from a furry creature, and when it was attacked or being pursued by a predator, it could make its fur stand on end and it would look bigger and the predator would go away. Well, I don't think that actually works somehow. I think the rabbits and whatever they do still get caught and eaten. But the hair does stand on end when you are stressed and when you are cold. Well, the Erector Pili muscle actually has a much more subtle function than that. And here is a photo of an actual hair follicle. And you can see there is, in this photo, there's a sort of strip of muscle attaching to the oil gland. And in fact, the real function of this is to help extrude the oil onto the surface so that the skin is lubricated. And if the hair does stand on end, that does extend the range of the hairs as touch receptors, because it makes them stand up more vertical. But we need to think of, now, when do we get really extreme stresses? Well, yes, when you're cold, that is a stress. And also when you are fearful. And the reason for that is that the Erector Pili muscle is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. It's smooth muscle, so that when you have strong stresses, the autonomic nervous system tends to go into overdrive. And so you get these extreme reactions. So it's an extreme reaction of what is an otherwise normal function. And if we put things into the biblical history context, we need to ask ourselves this question: would human beings have been cold or stressed in the original very good world that God made? but the Erector Pili muscle is still there. It is a useful functioning muscle. It wasn't designed to make our hair stand on end. After all, that's not going to be much use if you're being pursued by a hungry tiger or anything like that with the size of the hairs we've got. But that muscle is there for a function. And because we are now subjected to extreme and strong stresses, yes, it does have this rather sort of quirky effect of causing goosebumps. And finally, one that some of you may have experienced with a great deal of pain is wisdom teeth, which are third molars. So in fact, they're the teeth right at the very back, and they erupt in the late teenage years to early adult years, supposedly at the time when you are growing out of childhood and gaining some wisdom. I'll leave that to the parents of late teenagers to decide whether that's actually true. But anyway, the third molars, and they are considered to be a problem because sometimes they don't grow out. And this is an X-ray of a young person where if you look along the bottom row of teeth, they haven't quite erupted yet, and sometimes they just get stuck there. The top ones have erupted, but they haven't come right down yet. Now, sometimes the ones that don't erupt then cause problems because they're stuck in the jaw and they have to be removed. What you've got here is a mismatch in the growth of the jaw and the growth of the teeth. And even the secular scientists will admit that this is actually a problem that seems to be related to the sort of diet that we eat. It's more of a problem in places where you have a softer diet. And over the last few centuries or so, as we've eaten softer foods, our jaws don't sort of quite grow as much as they should. And also there just seems to be a general degeneration. So it's an example of a downhill process. It's nothing to do with evolution. And we do need to ask the question, well, maybe some of these so-called vestigial structures are actually really degenerate structures, and they're nothing to do with where we came from, but they might be something to do about where we're going. Let's look at a few non-human ones, but we will come back to that question because it's important, and it does actually come up with some of the non-human ones. All right, whale pelvic bones, considered to be completely useless. Now, if you've been to the Natural History Museum in London, you may have seen this. It's the skeleton of a blue whale. I was very sad that they took away that dinosaur that they used to
Dippy.
have.
Dippy the Diplodocus.
Yes, that's right. Well, actually, he is back, but they haven't put him back into the main hall there. They've put him in an area by himself. So you can still go and see him, but in the main entrance, they have this blue whale. Now, somewhere in there are some whale pelvic bones, and they are considered to be the vestiges of the time when whales evolved from a four-legged creature that lived on land but decided, well, it didn't like it and wanted to go back to the sea. And you may just be able to see them, but there they are a little bit closer there. What use could bones like that be? Well, again, going back to the coccyx, bones form anchor points and stabilizers, and they can do that without being physically adjacent or, abutting another bone. They can still form a solid anchor point within a muscle, within a tendon, or within a ligament. And so they are there as part of the stabilizers for ligaments that hold the whale's pelvic bones, the whale's reproductive structures. And again, even the secular scientists accept that. It's just that never gets out into the general public. Now, what about flightless birds? Again, this Live Science article made this point. Ostriches and cassowaries, that's a picture of a cassowary, which is an Australian bird, and it's a big bird, are among several birds that have wings that are vestigial. And this was an interesting story that came about in New Scientist a few years later. They wrote an article about vestigial organs, and this was from their article, The Existence of Something as Spectacularly de trop as the ostrich wing is only a problem for those who believe in an intelligent designer. And the interesting thing about this story was the follow-up to it, right? An ostrich farmer actually replied to this article. Now, I've no idea whether he was a Christian or he wasn't, but he was speaking from his actual experience. And this is important. Your actual experience does matter. And that is the very reason that we are having an open day for this museum, because we want people to come and see things with their own eyes, touch things with their own eyes, and use their own common sense. Your own life experience and your own observations do count. And they are important. And so this ostrich farmer wrote in and said that New Scientist, he actually named the journalist who wrote it, but we won't do that, describes ostrich rings as spectacularly de trop. I have kept ostriches for 18 years and can testify otherwise. He then wrote a whole long list of the functions of ostrich wings just from his own observations. And there were quite a lot of them. Thermoregulation was one important one, particularly in a hot country like South Africa. Interesting one was stability while running, because in fact ostriches can run extremely fast and they can do right angle bends without having to slow down. And the way they do that is to use their wings. Wings have courtship and communication functions in all birds, and so the same applies to ostriches. And they also form shelter for their young. They are a useful structure. In fact, ostriches were never meant to fly. Ostrich wings are just an extreme variation of wings in a bird that was designed to have a different sort of lifestyle. And if you think about it, there are other birds in that situation. No one thinks that penguin flippers are vestigial. So wings do more than fly. We need to look at the whole animal or the whole creature. Don't look at things in isolation. Nothing in biology works on its own, nothing in isolation. God made whole functioning ecosystems and whole functioning organisms to live in them. And but here is another interesting one about wings. This is a cormorant bird, which is a strong flyer, but you may have seen these birds sitting on rocks, holding their wings out to dry, as it were. It's a very distinctive pose. But even though they do that, they are good, strong flyers. But if you go to the Galapagos Islands, you'll see this rather scruffy-looking bird. And it is a genuinely flightless cormorant. This bird can't fly. It's actually a good diver, so it does survive in the Galapagos Islands, but it's stuck there. It's not going to fly away. This is a bird that has lost the ability to fly. So this is a true vestigial organ. There are such things as vestigial organs, but they have nothing to do with evolution. What they are is a loss of function. But these things are, this bird is still a cormorant. So the bird has not changed in kind. It's just lost a function. And that happens. And the same applies to another classic vestigial creature, the blind cavefish. And this was the headline in the article from Live Science, growing up in the wrong neighborhood. Now, what did they mean by that? What they meant was that the fish that hatched out in these completely dark caves in this region in Central America where they live started to grow eyes as the fish started to develop in embryonic development. But then it gave up and they ended up with just a sort of membrane where their eyes ought to be. The interesting thing is there are fish of the exact same species that grow and live in light conditions, and they have functioning eyes. And some scientists did some studies on these fish, and they found that, in fact, the embryos, because remember, fish eggs hatch in water, they're not inside the mother fish, except for seahorses, which are inside a father fish. But these fish just hatch out in water in the river. And they need to be exposed to light to get the right sort of stimulation. Embryonic development is a whole series of steps, but have to get the right stimulation to get the next step in the sequence to develop. So growing up in the wrong neighborhood, yes, being stuck in the dark, and they don't develop any eyes. But if they grow up in the light, well, they do develop eyes. So so again, it's a degeneration. So we need to look, what is the real significance of vestigial organs? Well, the whole idea that there are some parts of our bodies that are useless is actually a testament to our ignorance. It was ignorant back in the 1890s when we didn't know what the endocrine glands did. It was ignorance that we didn't know what the appendix did, or the coccyx, or all of those other, or arm swinging, until somebody actually overcame that prejudice. And human curiosity does prevail, and we should be grateful for that, and their functions have been revealed. So nothing vestigial there. Functions have been revealed simply because human curiosity has overcome evolutionary prejudices. But there are some vestigial organs or some degenerate organs which are genuine loss. But again, that's not evolution. It's a reminder of biblical biology. Initially, it was very good, and we see design. So we see design in arm swinging. We see design in the way hair follicles work. We see design in the appendix. But there are some things that have gone downhill, and because the world came under the effects of sin and judgment. So lots of things like mutations, disease, natural selection, and of course death, all real processes, but none of them are evolutionary processes. The world has certainly changed, but it definitely has not evolved.